Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you for inviting me, and apologies for the hiccup at the beginning. All right, so this is John. To let me just jump right in, and as Sebastian mentioned, feel free to interrupt me whenever you feel like. This is John to work with Sebastian Heise at the New York Fed, and so the usual disclaimer applies. And I am Tommaso. All right. Whoops. Okay. So very broadly, we are essentially motivated by a large literature that studies the difference in productivities within countries. And so, there is very large literature on rural-urban wage gaps, or also, essentially whatever country you look at, you have often big differences in average wages or in average labor productivity across locations. Now, of course, we are not the first one to make this observation, and there is a large literature that usually somehow interprets these barriers as suggesting the presence of friction, such as moving costs that prevents labor from moving and arbitraging these differences away. Now, taking this in mind, really our starting point in this paper is to kind of notice that, of course, from an eagle eye perspective, you see this big spatial heterogeneity. But if you zoom in, essentially, even within locations, you see still a lot of productivity or wage heterogeneity, not across, in that case, across firms, across production units within location. And somehow, really our contribution in this paper, it is to try to take these two perspectives together, right? The first one, the spatial heterogeneity, which usually is the focus on kind of in the trade literature or the urban literature or the macro divo. And the second one, which is usually more the focus of the labor literature of heterogeneity across firms. And what we try to kind of claim it is that taking these two perspectives into account, jointly, is actually useful if you want to really understand how important, how relevant from a quantitative perspective the spatial frictions are. And why? Well, hopefully by the end of the talk, I will convince you that once you take seriously into account that, even within each local labor market, there is serious heterogeneity, and there are frictions, labor market frictions that prevent labor from kind of reaching the good firms even within locations. Taking this into account changes not only the quantitative kind of cost of spatial frictions, but also the mechanism through which they operate. Now, I have a short introduction because I have lots of stuff to show you. I just want to give you a bit of a sense of kind of what's coming in the next hour or so. I will go through three kind of blocks. The first one, let's see if I can close this. Yes, the first one, essentially, I will just show you some data, a few motivating facts. This is the setting of our paper is Germany. I will kind of try to argue that Germany is an ideal setting if you want to kind of study the impacts of spatial barriers. Why? Because there is a lot of heterogeneity across regions in wages and productivity. But also we'll show you a few facts to hopefully try to convince you and make the point that it's important to look at both movement of labor across regions and across firm within regions. And here intuition is fairly simple, right? Every time that essentially every movement across location is also movement across firms. And so somehow you want to take both of them into account and try to kind of really benchmark one against the other to really get a sense of the true impact of kind of spatial of migration moves. I will then write down a model. This is essentially a model in the traditional Burdett and Mortensen, if you're familiar with that model, which is a model with firm heterogeneity and with labor market friction. And we are going to kind of take that block that we kind of know well how it works and embed it into a model that has a little bit of a notion of space. So in particular, we're going to have different regions. We're going to have different type of wedges or spatial barriers that prevents workers from searching from other locations, that kind of constrain their mobility, and also some sort of home bias that people may have a taste, and if you're born in a given location, you may just like to live there. We then kind of take the data and the model together. We estimate it. I'll discuss a little bit how we identify through the structure of the model the different spatial frictions, and then we run some counterfactual. We do several exercises. I will just show you a few today. But kind of what you want to, you know, take in mind, we're going to do something, some sort of like a very standard, like, you know, aggregate counterfactual, where essentially we just like, you know, shut down all the spatial frictions, and we're going to find like, you know, relatively large productivity gains. As kind of like, you know, potentially expected, we're going to find that the gains are larger for like, you know, people born in the east of Germany, which is the low productivity regions, and for the east of Germany in general. But then really, like, you know, our key contribution is to try to kind of like, you know, shed light on the mechanism. And I will show you that essentially all like, you know, these aggregate gains come mainly from within region reallocation, rather than like, you know, the more standard kind of you remove a border and people migrate from low to high productivity regions. And you know, let me not explain them right now. I will spend a lot of time trying to like, you know, really pinpoint why the within regional location improves if you reduce spatial frictions. Really, if there is like, you know, one kind of thinking, yeah.
Can I make a question?
Of course, Carlos.
Can relationship-specific capital be a friction for the misallocation? Maybe you don't.
I do not.
Relationship?
I do not.
No.
So you'll see essentially the model is going to be like a relatively simple, and essentially the model is going to have just as much as heterogeneity and moving part as those that I can like identify in the data. Once I show you the model, I'll tell you where I think that if there is some sort of relationship specific capital, where it will show up.
Okay.
And it will show up as a more general, like, you know, labor market frictions, unless you believe that is location specific. And if it is location specific, it will show up as some sort of like, you know, comparative advantage towards a certain location. But I'll, you know, and if I forget, please remind me, but I'll tell you, like, you know, later on where I think it will show up in the model, in terms of like, you know, which part of the model will capture this, the misspecification from not accounting for that, like, you know, relationship capital. Okay, so then, you know, the big takeaway, if there is like, you know, one thing I want you to kind of try to remember from today, is that really, like, you know, the effect of spatial frictions depends on the local labor market. And so, you know, just to give like an example to make this salient, you know, think of like, you know, two countries, India and Bangladesh. They may look like, you know, the same in terms of having like, you know, the same wage gaps or productivity gaps across locations. We may estimate like, you know, the same spatial frictions, but then the cost of these frictions from an aggregate perspective may be very different, depending on whether essentially how the local labor market function. So depending on the extent of labor market frictions. Okay, so these really like somehow, we hope that this paper is like, you know, pushing more and more people into trying to like, you know, not forget the local labor market when studying kind of like, you know, geographic mobility of labor. Okay, any question on the introduction before I move like, you know, into the meat of the paper? Javier? No, Javier, I've seen a hand, but then it's not there anymore. So should I just go ahead? Okay. All right, so, okay, motivating facts. And so again, like these are the facts that I will first show you somehow as a, actually, let me say this. I will first show you like, you know, this data essentially in an theoretical perspective, but then these are really going to be like, you know, the moment that we target when we estimate the model. So I will give you like a little bit of a hint of somehow like, you know, which type of features of the model these particular facts are relevant for. Okay, so data, what data do we have? Essentially like three main data sources, two are really the key one. We have a panel of firms. So these are the establishment level. I will say firms, but essentially everything in today's presentation is at the level of the establishment. And this essentially is representative. It covers like, you know, all like, you know, establishment in East and West Germany. And it gets like, you know, we have half of them. And then I have like, you know, meshed employee data. So the advantage of this data is that really like, you know, tracks like, you know, one individual, as that individual can like, you know, moves across like, you know, firms within a location, but also like, you know, across different locations. This data is not representative, and so that is why like it's important to kind of like, you know, look at both of them together, because somehow when we want to look at like, you know, some sort of like, you know, facts that describe like in the firm size distribution, we want to be sure to use the BHP. We are then going to deflate all the data using prices at the county level. Unfortunately, we only have this for like 1 year, 2009, but there is quite a bit of like spatial heterogeneity. We wanted to try to be sure to measure really like real wages, and so that is why we use the deflator. We don't do much to the data. Essentially, we focus on like we look daily wages because we don't have hours, so that's the best we could do. Since we don't have hours, we only focus on like full-time workers, and for most of the analysis, we focus on the period 2009 to 2014. So the idea here is that we want essentially not to study the initial phase after the reunification, but to focus on somehow the persistent gap and look at the market, which is roughly steady state. I have another paper, if you're interested, in which we study instead the initial transition from a planned to market economy. And in that paper, actually, we show that by the late 2000s, everything is kind of boring, meaning that really like, the East and West looks in steady state, even though there's a persistent gap, but nothing more is changing. All right, so let me start showing you some data. So this is a map of Germany, of course. So this is the East, this is the West. This like, a black line here is the like, former border between East and West. This white part here is Berlin. Since unfortunately our data do not allow us to distinguish between East and West Berlin, we just drop it. And now this map is color coded so that each Kreis or county, which is this like geographic unit here, is colored depending on the wage. And what you can see is essentially that even like, today, you still have like a big like spatial wage gap where wages is higher in the West than in the East. And really like the gap between East and West kind of swamps the heterogeneity within West and within East. We have like a lot of like buttons here because we've been working on this agenda for quite a lot of time. Without clicking them, let me just say that this is not about kind of like basic sorting like high education people are in the West. This is not about like industrial composition. Essentially, it holds like for within every industry, within every skill group, and so on and so forth. Okay, really, we have essentially like big wage gap between East and West. We also do some sort of like AKM regression, which actually is what we target in the model, and that shows that in terms of unobservable, there is higher like wages or productivity if you really believe the structural interpretation of an AKM in the West. But still, like essentially 2/3 of the wage gap is really like firm fixed effect, firm's component paying higher wage in the West and in the East. So if you look at this, you really like will come out with a neoclassical perspective of saying, look, I know that this is not a border anymore, but it seems almost that there is a border, and if you remove it, then you should observe kind of like net migration from East to the West, and that should like increase wages. Okay, at least like for people in the East and generate productivity gains. However, once you kind of like look a little bit harder, you see that even within East and within West, and even like within like each one of these Kreis, there is a massive amount of heterogeneity. And so this is essentially what these two figures are going to capture. So what are we doing here? This is literally just like PDF of the like so the distributions of wages within West for blue and within East for red. Again, like if you look at the appendix of our paper, you get the same if you even like have Kreis fixed effect. So the point is that sure, from here it looks like there is like this big divide, but from here it looks that of course the distribution in the West is shifted to the right, to data point are consistent, but there is a massive amount of heterogeneity even within East and within West. So somehow even just like shifting labor within East from bad to good firm will pretty much close the gap. This is the left figures. What is the right figure? This is another way to like look at this is essentially just plotting the wage as a function of firm size. And again, this is West, this is East. So what do we get from this figure? Well, first we see that this ladder, which is kind of like reassuring since we're going to write down a model with a ladder where bigger firms pay higher wage. But also we see essentially that you can achieve somehow the same size in the East, say like think of size 8 by paying like lower wage. So it is as if firms in the East face like some sort of like lower how you say like lower competition. Of course you could have like different figures where maybe really these two lines are on top of each other, but just maybe the lower distributions of wages in the East is because firms are smaller and they're low productive. And instead, really, it seems that for a not it seems that it's clear that for a given size of the firm, the wage is higher, and then interpret structurally that is going to point towards some notion of essentially higher competition within the West and within the East, so that in the West, really, you need to pay a higher wage to kind of grow larger. Okay, any question on the first fact? All right, let me then go to the second kind of set of facts, I guess. More than 3 facts are 3 set of facts. What we look at next, we look at the wage gain. Yeah.
The ladder, but of workers is
Alejandro?
in terms of ages, in terms that
Sorry?
if you can, if the data about the evolution of wages when you become older in the West is different from the East or is similar?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And essentially, if you look at in 1992, it's very different. So the age wage profile in 1992, so essentially right after the reunification, is very flat in the East and very steep in the West. Kind of suggesting that in the East, people really didn't climb a ladder and so on and so forth. Then if you look at if you move over time, you see that the profiles in the East become steeper and steeper and steeper. And by the year 2005, it's still a little bit flatter than the West, but comparable. And so it really seems that this kind of job ladder essentially within the East and within the West is not super different, at least the first order. And again, if you're interested, we have this other paper that doesn't have the model yet. Hopefully, we're going to have a new draft soon, but has all the facts. It's called Transforming Institution, and there we really show somehow the evolution of the labor market, where the beginning in 1992, 95 in the East was very different, kind of flat ladder, and then a lot of mobility. But then by the year 2005, essentially everything looks very similar within East and within West.
I ask you something in the same vein is whether when Germany was unifying the labor code that's remained, which was, for example, let's assume that in the East, the severance payment was up to maximum of 10 years, and in the East was 5 years. Which of them remain after that? To see whether.
So at the beginning, there was a long period of kind of transitioning, essentially, where, for example, all the pension funds and so on and so forth were different. Now, my understanding is that most things after the Hertz III reform, essentially most things are unified. There are still differences in the sense, for example, a minimum wage, which is now implemented, is a little bit lower in the East, but that is because essentially it is indexed to kind of productivity. For some occupations, I know that there are some sort of licensing, which is location specific. But my understanding it is that mostly really now it works like a unified labor market as essentially unified set of rules. It's as if the institution labor market is the same in East and West. And at least since Hertz III, which I think was 2005, if I remember correctly. Okay. Now, second, set of facts is we want to look at wage gains. So essentially what we do it is, so right now I just show you kind of the distributions of wages. Now we want to track workers as they move essentially across jobs and as they migrate from East to West and vice versa. Now, what we do, we are going to differentiate workers by their home region. So think of it as workers that are born in the East or born in the West. And then really what we are doing, it is essentially a system of local projection. So, this is lots of kind of fancy notation, which maybe is a bit complicated, but essentially what we do, it is literally, we are just looking at the wage growth across events of workers migrating from East to the West or West to the East or firm to firm. And we have essentially dummies and controls for all of this. And we do a system of local projection, meaning that we look at the wage growth around the event, both before and after. Okay. Rather than describing you all these different coefficients, let me just kind of show you essentially the profiles of wages around an event which are implied by this estimate. But first, I see a question from Alejandra.
Yes. How do you account for immigration?
Immigration into Germany in general?
Yes.
Yeah, excellent question. So essentially, we restrict the sample to people that are either born in the East or born in the West. And now the way in which you know whether you're born in the East or West, by the way, is even, how you say, like, not perfect, in the sense that it's the first time that you observe you, because unfortunately you don't really know the place of birth. But we know the place of birth if you are like a foreigner. So if you are a foreigner, we have a dummy for it. And we essentially exclude all the foreigners. We use them, at least I think they're still in the draft somewhere. You can think of them as like a comparison group, because I now show you, like in a second, that there's a lot of home bias, like, East Germans like the East and West Germans like the West. And we show essentially that foreigners don't seem to like either the East or the West, which is like, reassuring. But essentially for most of the analysis, we just drop them.
Okay, because I was wondering.
And consider that
part of Germany, but you're saying there aren't. But the map you showed doesn't include immigrants. Then
it doesn't. And by the way, you're absolutely right. So don't get me wrong. It's not that they don't tend to concentrate around certain areas. They do. But in terms of like, the biases that I'll show you like in a second, they don't really seem to have like a strong bias. But of course, that doesn't mean that they're not like more likely to go like into certain areas. They're not more likely to enter into certain areas. So they do like, of course, follow like, similar certain patterns. Also notice that we like, stop in 2014. That's the last year we have the data. So we don't have like, anyway, the millions of like, recent migrants into Germany. They're not here. There are still like, quite a few migrants, like foreigners, but not the new waves of literally millions of people. Okay, so let me describe this figure, and then I start adding line. So first, look at like, the West, the black people here. This is like Westborn. And so this is really like their wage gains upon migration. So essentially, like, there is roughly no pre-trend before, and then like, after they move, their wage on average, and this is like a move from the East to the West, on average increases by like, 17, 18 percentage points, and then it stays flat. Okay, so this is how to interpret this figure. Everything is kind of like, relative to a person that doesn't move. A Westborn person that goes from the East to the West have like a 17% increase at the time of the move, and then kind of grows in parallel. How about an Eastborn person? Well, an Eastborn person have a much bigger increase of like roughly 35%. And these are moves from the East to the West. Now let's look at the opposite moves. So migrants that go from the West to the East. Now look at a Westborn that goes from the West to the East, have a similar increase as a person that go from East to West, of roughly like 17 percentage points. An Eastborn instead that goes back home, essentially doesn't see like the wage increase at all. So what do we see here? First, going west in general have a bigger wage increase. Okay, kind of as expected, because you are drawing from a distributions which is shifted to the right. And second, there is this big asymmetry, that is Eastborn have a bigger wage increase going west, while Westborn have a bigger wage increase going east, which essentially seems to suggest that Westborn are pickier when they move east, so they only accept those very good offers, and the opposite is true for Eastborn. And so this is essentially consistent with what like the literature usually call like home bias. You like to stay where you live, you need to be compensated to move away from where you live. Okay, so this is like Alejandra. Previously, I was saying that if you look at foreigners, you don't really see all these asymmetries. Now, the other point that I want to make is that, of course, you see these very big, like wage gains of movers from like East to West, and vice versa. But these people are selected, right? This is not like the counterfactual of like what if like you just remove any barriers to migration, right? Because like the people that move are the ones that receive good enough offers. And so maybe like a better benchmark would be to compare the people that move across regions to the people that move across firms within regions. And so these are like these black line here and like a black and gray. These are like the event studies for people that make a job-to-job move, either like within the West or within the East. And so essentially what I want again to give you the sense, it is that look, there are like big wage gains also just like climbing a job ladder within regions. And since every move across locations is a move across firms, somehow you want to try to like benchmark these like big gains here with the relative gains that you get from moving like within a location. Okay, and then of course what we are going to do structurally it is like, in the model, once you reduce spatial frictions, you're going to affect not only like, the number and the gains of the moves across locations, but also you're going to affect the local labor market, and therefore like, change essentially these gains here, this like, local labor market ladder.
And
Okay.
sorry, Tommaso,
Any question on wage gains? Yeah.
Yeah, about that fact.
Federico, yeah.
And this is like if you throw in sector differences and so on, it's still robust to that. So it's not about changing sectors or.
So
you have occupations, like, is there something about
like,
occupations?
yeah, like it's a little bit tricky how many controls you want to put in, right?
Yeah.
So what we can do, it is essentially you can control of everything at how you say, like at time 0 before the move. And so, for example, you can even have individual fixed effect. So you can literally look like, individuals relative to like, their own profiles, and the results are very similar. You can put in like, lots of like, industry dummies, occupation dummies, and the results are very similar. Now, once you start kind of controlling for just general occupations and general industry dummies, also you don't see like no big difference. And the reason it is that these industries and occupation like compositions doesn't really captures a lot of East versus West. Of course, you can think, well, but maybe really some occupations are different in the West. So once you start having occupations, time, locations, then you kill a lot of this action.
Yeah.
But that is, but then like, you're a little bit like in a land of no identification. So you don't really know, is it because is like, managers in the West are special, or is just like, going to the West are special? Like some sort of general, either like, time 0, any type of fixed effect, or even some sort of like, general industries or occupation characteristics, which are forced to be identical in East and West, don't kill this result at all. Do honestly very, very little, like, change it with the slopes, the noise, but like, the wage gains are very, very similar. And we have all this stuff in the appendix.
So this is similar. You run with fixed effects at the individual level, not at the firm level, like in a CAM model, to see whether the question is more, can you identify a firm fixed effect and person fixed effect well with the ACA model, or because whether the set is compact?
Yeah. So this is not, so another stuff that you can do is you can look at the AKM fixed effect at the firm level, and then that will actually reduce this by quite a bit. So like, East workers that move to the, for example, like, East to, I think by 50%, but I don't remember exactly. But like, if you look at the Eastbourne worker that moves to the West, it's gonna move to a much higher, like, AKM firm fixed effect, but not like, 35 percentage point, maybe more something like 20, meaning that, they are also tend to like, get good jobs within firms. But this is not exactly what you asked, but I think it was an important point to stress still. What you ask it is, how well do you estimate the AKM fixed effect? And the answer is very well. And part of the reason is also like, the sampling that is a little bit skewed towards like, the very big firms. So actually our connected set covers 97% of all workers. So you drop very, very little. Also, so, like, if you are familiar with AKM literature, sorry?
No, but so at the end, you're very confident that most of this action is at the personal level. So in some sense, that's the issue. That's when you
most of these actions is that you go to firms that pay a higher wage.
Yeah, but you say that when you control by firm fixed effects,
it goes down. It goes down. It explains. Yeah, it goes down. It explains still like, more than half of this is firm fixed effect.
Okay.
So firm fixed effect is definitely like, a key component of what's happening here. It's essentially you go to like, high paying firms. It's not all of it, but it's definitely like, the majority of it. I think it's like 60% at least. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's definitely the majority of it. And then like, the firm fixed effect, you're very confident in terms of estimating them. Also, like, if you're familiar with the AKM literature, there is of course a huge deal with like, biases, right? The limited mobility bias and so on and so forth. Now, all of those stuff don't really apply here because we only care about like, first moment, so just means. And so all those issues are a big problem for the variances. So if you care about like, the distributions of this fixed effect, but if you only care essentially about the average in the East versus the average in the West, or the average when you move, all those moments are unbiased.
Good.
I guess it's still useful to know, like, if you do like BLM, like if you cluster firms, it's still useful to know whether these are movements like between or within clusters, right? It might be that they're kind of different pay, but sort of roughly within similar sort of cluster of firms, or not.
Like,
although
yeah,
I
no,
guess,
that's
I
fair
guess
to
if
think
you're
about.
saying
Like,
that it's
consider that
60%, it's a lot, but still would
you're
be
never
good
gonna
to know whether it's
cluster.
robust.
No, I agree. I think that would be interesting. I agree. So, we'll see. Now, currently the paper is submitted. It's one of those stuff that, if my referees will ask me to do it, I would be happy to do it because I think there is some value there. Honestly, I've never done like the BLM on this on this specific data set. Consider that, for the moves across locations is very unlikely. I guess it depends, right? It depends what you put in the BLM clustering. If you allow clusters within east and west, that's true. Maybe they are actually staying within the same cluster. Yeah, I honestly don't know. I don't want to speculate too much. I think it's an interesting question. Yeah. It's a fair point, honestly. It's a fair point, and honestly, we should we use the AKM stuff. We should probably show these exact figures with the AKM fixed effect, and we don't do it in the paper. We just have the so that was a question.
Yeah, I had a question. You said that when you run this with individual fixed effects, the results are the same basically, right?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I was just wondering whether
sorry, Marco.
profile.
Sorry to interrupt you. So it's key. This is a regression in differences. So the just level is always out. The level of individual fixed effect. So when I say individual fixed effect, I mean individual fixed effect in growth. So essentially, in the differences. Yeah. Was that what you were getting at?
No, I don't think so. So I wonder whether the age profiles of the workers moving might be different. Like you could also imagine that because they're like kind of going back home, and therefore there might be like older people that are moving back to their like the Westbourne going back to the West, and therefore their wage gains are also going to be smaller just because of the age profiles of the workers.
So we have we had the rich set of controls, and in particular, age, of course, is there. So we control for age, and so then given the age, essentially the reason that this line is flat, it means that after the move, you want to think of it as compared to individuals. If you believe that is a random move compared to individuals, and think of the one that moves from the east to the west, essentially has a big jump, but then it falls a parallel profile. And that is you see that because essentially this line is flat. Of course, there is still going to be a profile, but it's just parallel relative to the people that didn't move.
Perfect. Thank you.
And since there are age controls, you want to interpret these very big gains as the gain of an individual, a young individual making that move.
Thank you.
No, thank you. All right. So let me then move to the last fact, which is essentially on job-to-job flows. So we look at prices. Now let's look at quantities. What we do is simply run a gravity equation for the flows across every counties, which is this small geographic unit, and then we control for distance, and we have origin and location fixed effect, which are allowed to vary by the place of birth. So I'm allowed Eastbourne workers to be more attracted to East counties and vice versa. And again, let me just show you the results in a figure, and we allow for somehow border. We allow for on top of distance for crossing the border to be costlier. What do we find? Well, this is the coefficients on the gravity on the distance. So people move much more locally than farther away, kind of as expected from gravity model. You can see that within and across regions is exactly the same. So once you control for essentially distance, there is no really a role of the border. Instead, what's happening it is that there is a big role for this individual fixed effect. So what I'm plotting here, it is the difference of the fixed effect estimated for east versus west. And these the distance to the border. So these are counties in the east, and these are counties in the west. And so if a dot is above the 0 line, it means that east workers are really more attracted to those counties. If it is below, it means that west workers are more attracted to those counties. Essentially, what you see is that east workers are attracted to the east and west workers are attracted to the west. Okay. Why do you get this? Because essentially, condition on a move, there is a lot of return migration. Okay. So like, people like, do move quite a lot, but then like, East workers go to the West and then they come back. And so another way to look at this, it is essentially like, just looking at just kind of, the overall number of moves. Like, per month, it is like 1% of the workers can like, move within region, while only like, very, very few move across regions. However, there is like, enough mobility that over the whole like, period of time, actually quite a few of like, Eastbound workers spend some time in the West. So, roughly 1 in 4. But lots of these people can come back home. Okay, so like, you don't want to like, you don't have to remember all these numbers, of course. But what I'm going to give you like a sense, it is that there is a lot of mobility in Germany, similar to the US, but most of mobility is kind of local. And there is still like, quite a bit of migration, but a lot of like, often these migration periods are fairly short-lived. So you go to the West, you have like a big wage gains, but then you cannot come back. Okay. And so somehow like, there is a global ladder that people climb, meaning within all Germany, but it's definitely distorted because people tend to be always like attracted back home. Okay. Any question on the data before I go to the model?
A quick question about the last part only. This is the average during the whole period or percent? Has it changed? For example, the mean years away has been changed over time, believing that after just the reunification, you can believe that people go to see what's going on, but after that, it's more have been changing or not? It's to have an idea. It's quite impressive.
Yeah, it's a little bit. Okay, a few things. So first, I don't know. I actually think I computed that, but I don't remember. Honestly. Now, these numbers here, so these two numbers and this one here is only estimated for the main window, that is 2009 to 2014. Okay. When instead these two numbers here, the cross borders and return movers, this is over the whole period from 92. But this and this is just like for the last 4 periods. Now, how does this varies? I don't remember, frankly. I honestly don't remember. There is a little bit this issue that it's hard to kind of compare it. So I think it's kind of declines over time, but it's a little bit mechanical, right? Because somehow like like this is only people conditional coming back, and then of course like if you increase it, but like broadly the notion that there were a lot of like short moves and then people come back, it's kind of true. But if I remember correctly, this had a trend, but the trend was mechanical, and then we tried to like understand how to like get rid of the mechanical trend, and we didn't really know how to do it, and then we gave up. So that's essentially my recollection.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
But like just in terms of migration, like because it's an interesting question, just to tell you like a bit of the big picture. You have 1 million people kind of moving early on from east to the west, just net. And then after that, after a few years, like of a lot of net migration, then you roughly have steady state. So there is very little like net migration from east to the west, and there is like a lot of people from west going east and coming back, and vice versa. But that big kind of like wave is definitely kind of like back in the days, and I think that those people, more of those people, then eventually stayed in the west. Okay, model. So we're going to write down a model essentially to kind of try to quantify again the effect of spatial fictions, and really want to have a model that essentially like allows us to study the allocation of labor both within regions, across firms, and between regions. Okay. And really like the model somehow it is like motivated and grounded into those facts. So we're going to have, of course, since we have wage dispersion both within and between regions, we want to have some sort of firm heterogeneity and labor market frictions that prevent workers from all going to the good firms. We are going to have like a notion of essentially different like spatial wedges to try to like match the effects I just show you, and again we're going to have a semi-integrated ladder so that people like move to the west, but only frequently, and so on and so forth. Somehow like we want our model, at least in practice, in principle, to be consistent with the effects I just showed you. Now I'm doing kind of
just a question on sort of big picture on the model. So what about the role of market power? Do you see that like whatever market power can generate will be absorbed by your wedges, or how can you account for differences in market power in East and West, and also within East and within West?
So it's definitely not absorbed by our wedges. So market power is a key component. So this is, I'm going to write down a model which is essentially a monopsony model, and where the that's Burette Mortensen, and where the market power is endogenous. And so really like a lot of what you're showing, what you're seeing in the counterfactual, it is essentially the monopsony power changing.
Okay.
And so that's gonna be like a key part of it. Now it's super hard to estimate the monopsony power directly. And so somehow we are just like relying on like indirect inference to the lens of the model. We don't have like something like specific that really points to like monopsony power, apart from the figure I showed you before, which is essentially like the wage size relationship. And because that through the lens of the model I'm going to write down the firm size condition on wage, essentially is going to tell me something about the monopsony power. But that is not like direct, it is essentially indirect through the lens of the model I'm writing down.
Okay.
But it's an excellent point. So like that's honestly like if I think about the to-do list of what I would like to have, it is I would like to find like nice ways to like really get that. It's hard because I don't have anything on the firm side, so I don't receive. No, okay. This is like it's a pain in Germany. Essentially, you have like rich administrative data, but you have essentially nothing on the firm side on this data. And so without that, it's really hard to kind of get a direct grasp on it. Yeah, but if you have any idea, please let me know, because this is super important. I think.
I mean, one thing you could do is that you could sort of run the sort of way of estimating market power by the labor IO literature, like Lamadon, Mogstad, and Seltzer, and instead of using firm's value added, you use the total wage bill of the firm.
Yeah. No, that's fair.
I know that maybe you don't have the full. I don't know if the sample includes like all the workers within a firm, but like
it doesn't in my LEAP, but it does in the BHP. So and also like now I have access to the universe, so maybe that's something that is worthwhile to do it. I think it's a good point. Okay, let me like push forward a little bit. I'm just gonna give you like an overview of the model without kind of like the details of the algebra, which are fairly standard once you understand kind of like the big moving part, because I want to show you the results. So again, it's Burdett and Mortensen plus regions plus wedges plus also endogenous search of workers. Just think of a continuous time economy that has J locations. Like every location has workers and firms. What workers do? Workers are like sitting in a job or unemployed. They file applications towards each location. So I am in like Munich, and I file application towards like any other location, like Stuttgart and Frankfurt and Berlin. And then what they do is they receive offers and they decide to accept an offer or not. Now workers differ by their type, and the type which is essentially heterogeneity. Workers may have a preference, so may really like a worker I may really like a location J. They have skills, so they may potentially be good at working in one location or another, competitive advantage. They have search efficiency, which is bilateral. So you're in a given location J, you may be good or bad at searching different location X, and they have a mobility cost. And workers are either employed or unemployed. What firms do? Well, firms post wages and vacancies. So firms are exogenously located in a place. They have an exogenous productivity. And then what they do is they say, okay, I post X number of vacancies with an associated wage. Okay. And essentially have these two tools to kind of grow. If you post a high wage, you're going to attract more workers. That's a standard kind of Burette and Mortensen mechanism, and you're going to retain them. But also you can just grow by posting more vacancies. And economically, there is no reason why you want to have both margin, essentially just to have an additional parameters to match the data. So to match both the firm size distribution and the wage distribution, essentially. There is also some sort of tradable and local good, nothing major there, just because you want to have some sort of local congestion. Labor market, there is a matching function that essentially takes vacancies and applications together. There is a matching function in every location, and just generates matches, and then matches are assigned. So once there is a new match, if it is accepted, the worker moves from one firm to another, or from unemployment into employment. And so really essentially this is just a machinery that generates mobility of labor both within location, but also between locations. And all these different wedges here are going to modulate the extent to which workers move more locally or across locations. Again, let me skip the details because I'm not doing great with time. Now there is one details meaning like essentially the equations. There is like, one thing that I really want to like, stress out, that is essentially there are like, two sources of frictions here that keep workers at low productivity. The labor market frictions, which essentially operate within regions, and why there are different sources of them. There is a convex vacancy posting that also like, prevents good firms from just inundating the market with vacancies. There is a convex cost on the side of workers that prevent kind of mismatched workers to just like, send tons of applications. And then we also have a preference shock. So every time you meet a firm, they're going to just draw like, a preference shock. Do you like it or you don't like the firm? And this is essentially just to kind of like, smooth out the transition, but it generates essentially another source of frictions because it reduces the allocative power of wages. So you don't only have workers moving up the ladder, but also down the ladder, as in the data. You then have spatial frictions that hinder labor mobility between regions. This is like, comparative advantages. Maybe you're just good at working in the place where you're born. Maybe it's just mobility cost, which is a one-time cost you pay. Maybe it's just that you don't like to be in the other regions, or maybe you just don't generate job opportunities. So you have these different sources of frictions, and we are going to be able to kind of separate identify them using the matched employer-employee data and using both wage gains and flows. Okay, so the identification is heuristic, but still let me give you like, a little bit of a sense of how we kind of pin down, in particular, the different sources of spatial frictions. And so really like, you can do that like, in figures. And so what I'm showing here is just like, consider a worker which is currently employed at a wage W, and just like, draws kind of like, random offers from this distribution here. What are you going to accept? Just take like, the limit when like, the preference shock doesn't matter. The argument is more general. You're going to essentially accept the offers above a given cutoff. So then what do we observe in the data is we observe people moving from this wage W into like, one wage W prime in here, okay? Because you only observe the offers that are accepted. Now let's think about decreasing the search efficiency, meaning that workers are not that able to generate offers. What does that do in this figure? It just like, lowers the density of offers. You don't get different offers, you just get fewer of them. So what does that generate? It reduces flows, but it doesn't change the typical wage gain, because the typical wage gain is just the difference between W and the average W prime. Now instead consider what happens if you, decrease the tau, so make people not willing to move to a different region. That is going to change the cutoff to the right, because if you are in the east, you don't really like to go to the west, you're going to be choosier, so you only accept fewer offers. And so this is not only decreasing the flows, because the flows is just the mass here, but also increase the average wage gain, because on average, only the very good offers are accepted. And so now you can see how targeting together both the wage gains and the flows essentially allows us to separate identify these like, taste parameters from the just like, search efficiency that just prevents people from like generating job opportunities. Okay, any questions on kind of like, broadly the model and the identification before like, I move forward to the estimation?
May I ask you, can you explain again the letter C? I didn't.
Yes,
follow.
this one, yeah. So what's happening here? So again, like, if the letter A is clear, so these are the accepted, this is not accepted.
Yeah.
Now, here, I'm essentially decreasing the tau. The tau is a taste parameter. So remember that essentially, if you decrease the tau, it means that you don't really like these regions where you're going. So now what this does, it shifts the cutoff to the right, because now only the very, very good offers you're going to be willing to accept them. So all this essentially like, mass here that you are willing to accept if you like to go in the West, you're not willing to accept if you don't like to go in the West. And so then what is the result? The result is that you have fewer flows, because there are fewer of those very good offers, but also that condition on single person moving, you should see a big wage gains. And so it's really by targeting kind of wage gains and flows at the same time, we are able essentially to separate the two. Now, the one of you that are kind of like, have a very like, critical sense, you probably already realize that there is a fundamental identification assumption here. It is that essentially you just like, draw randomly from the distribution. And of course, that is in terms of interpretation. So you can interpret the Z essentially either as just like, sampling few job offers or just sampling many bad job offers. Okay, those those two things are we cannot, since we do not observe the offers that you receive, we cannot separately identify the two. And so that we need to go through, we need to use this assumption.
In this case, I think that I will more, the question about the random is conditional that you already accept, you will have different type of draw. So in here, my understanding that this type of model, that every time you get completely IID shocks.
That's correct.
So this could be more problematic now in terms of flow, particularly in terms of flows, because
so every time you get IID shocks,
the people who start to change front and back are different people from the average one, and here you will get, my understanding, you will be born bias to have taken for every part of the distribution.
So that is correct. So essentially, I'm going to assume that everyone has the same parameters. And then if you believe that the people, then this is like, this is a very general identification problem. That is that, and you're absolutely right. You observe essentially, you identify parameters out of movers. And if you believe that movers are different than non-movers, you have problems.
Essentially. One sentence, you have more data here that you can see whether the mover are the people who move already or not. So the issue more is that whether the draw of the random variable is unconditional, whether you already got a good draw or a bad draw before, something like this. I think that's
that's a very good point. So that's something which we have not done, but you could do essentially to say, okay, does the history of the past moves in the model, the history of the past predicts the future, and we can try to see whether that predicts the future the same in the data or whether the data kind of over predicts. That's something actually is a very nice exercise. We have not done it, and I think we could. Okay. So let me jump to estimation. So what do we do? Instead of doing just east and west, we want to have 4 regions. So 2 in the east, 2 in the west, just to be able to distinguish is it really about east versus west, or is it just about location? We are going to assume that mobility costs are symmetric. So then moving from east to the west or west to the east has the same mobility cost. And so then the asymmetries are all driven by taste. We calibrate everything that has direct counterpart, and we jointly estimate the rest by stimulated measure of moment, fairly standard. Now, I'm just going to show you a little bit of our moments, targeted moments, and kind of model fit. Essentially, we'll only focus on wage gains and labor flows, okay, which is essentially the core. And just trust me that the rest kind of makes sense, and everything, all the details are in the paper. So this is wage gains and labor flows, and we have different combinations, right? A different type of moves, within location, and different types of people, people that are born in that location or not. And I'm going to show them to you, one by one. So these essentially are the wage gains for people that are within location. There are many, because you can be northeast, moving within northeast, and so on and so forth. They tend to have moderate wage gains around 10%, both in the data on the x-axis and in the model on the y-axis. And they tend to be very frequent. So there are a lot of these labor flows, both in the data and in the model. Okay, so these are of course targeted, but the model does a very good job. Next, I look people that move from the east to the west. These moves are relatively infrequent, and they have associated big wage gains, both in the model and in the data. Then I look at people that go to the west, but they move back home. Again, not as big wage gains, and they're a little bit more frequent. Then I look at people that move to the east away. Again, not as big wage gains, because the east wage on average are worse, and definitely not many frequent, because people do not like to go to the east from the west, and those jobs are not great. And then I look at the people essentially that are East Germans that go back, and these are more frequent because they like to go back, and even lower wage gains. So essentially, the big picture it is that the kind of model matches very well the heterogeneity of wage gains and labor flows across all the different moves, which is kind of of course is targeted, but it's success to the extent that there is way more dots than moments, but somehow the dots are aligned in a way that the model really can essentially match the bulk of the heterogeneity, which essentially pretty much says that this is a relatively good model, sorry, to describe what's happening in the data. Okay, now we have other moments that we not show them, trust me that we do kind of reasonably good job We don't match everything perfectly, of course, and we describe it at length in the paper. What do we get out of this estimation? Bunch of frictions. Let me just highlight a couple of them. So the mobility cost is roughly 3 to 5% of PDV. So this is kind of success because it's reasonable. It's like $20,000. If you are familiar with the literature, papers like Cannon and Walker, for example, have $200,000-$300,000 mobility cost to move across states, which seems unreasonable. Why do we have a reasonable number here? Well, because we allow essentially for relative search efficiency to play a big heavy lifting. So then really this mobility cost is only estimated out of the wage gains, but the fact that we observe few people moving, we charge that to them having a hard time generating job opportunities. And so these numbers here are for different types of move. Let me not enter into the details, but you want to think of it as roughly you are less than 1/10 as efficient if you search far away than not if you search locally. So if you are in the Northeast, you generate offers from the Northeast with 1/10 of the effort that you need to generate offers from the Southwest. Again, this to me makes a lot of sense because people get job offers through referrals, through people that you work with, and so then it's much easier to kind of generate job opportunities locally. But really, having these objectives is then what allows us essentially to have reasonable numbers here and here. So this preference is a roughly 10% tax if you live away from the place where you're born. Okay, so that's kind of the model, the estimation. If you don't have any questions, let me show you essentially what to do with the model. Yes.
How does your result relate with the result of Petrangolo and Manning in terms of, because this is very related with which is the size of the labor market. So
it's very consistent. Now, it's hard to do a quantitative comparison because they have more granular data, but essentially it's very consistent with the fact that people really search locally, which is the same as they show in their AER paper. Is exactly I think it's one of the first papers we cite because essentially it's a motivation for what we do. But we haven't done the quantitative comparison. Sorry, Alejandro.
Yeah, my question. Which are the moments that really are driving this result? Do you have an idea? Some things that which are the ones that are moving? To have an idea where these numbers are coming from which moment?
Absolutely. So we do the usual kind of sensitivity check, which we have it in the paper, but is essentially all this stuff here are really pinned down by this.
Okay.
So pretty much what you want to get it is that given these wage gains that people go moving, you should see essentially much more moves. And now since you don't see that many moves, the model tells you, aha, it's because you don't generate job opportunities. Okay.
And what about moments of selection into these moves? Do you and does the model tell you anything about that you can take to the data sort of untargeted?
Selection into the moves, what do you mean?
Yeah, based, who is moving between regions depends probably on sort of either characteristics of the firms in which they are, or
no, that's true. That's
the history. Exploiting the dynamics would be useful, but I guess the model doesn't have any dynamics, but something that has to do with sort of what characteristics are driving selection into these moves, and whether the model can say something about that.
We've not done that, honestly, and I think it's kind of a good idea. Sorry, I thought that we had more moments there. So something that we do, so we do a little bit of that. So we target the fact that the relationship between wage gains and the initial wage, so the firm at which we work. So we are targeting the fact that workers are more likely to have big wage gains if they start from a low wage. We are targeting the mobility out, the relationship between the mobility and the initial wage. So we have some of those actually as targeted moments.
Okay.
So we decide rather than essentially doing this, what is targeted, was it untargeted, that I frankly don't like, because at the end of the day it's an arbitrary choice. We just put in everything that we think is relevant in the model, and we try to match everything, and we show everything. Those relationships, by the way, are the one that we don't match as well. So they're not in the slides, but they're in the paper, of course. We match the declining pattern, which is again is very reassuring, right? Because it's something that the model really wants and is true in the data, but in the model is more declining than in the data. So that tells us that, well, maybe there is something we're a little bit missing, but at least, we are in the ballpark quantitatively.
Okay.
But, we can, yeah. Okay, let me show you, some results in the next, I guess 15 minutes. And so then I leave 5 minutes at the end for other questions if you want. So, what we want to do, a few exercises essentially to try to understand, this relationship between, mobility across space and within space across regions. So the exercise that we are doing now is essentially just remove all the spatial fictions, okay? Like in the paper, we also remove them one at a time, but for now, just think of removing everything. So no spatial barrier whatsoever. That means removing the home preferences, removing the moving cost, and removing the search fictions. Not all the search fictions, we keep the within location labor market fictions, but we remove the between locations one. And then we are gonna look at the effects on GDP, wages, and then essentially the location of workers. Okay, so let's start from output per capita. So first, this bar here is on the aggregate. So in the whole Germany, what happens once you eliminate all the frictions? You have a roughly 4 to 5% increase in GDP, and a bigger increase in wage of roughly 9%. Why bigger in wage? Well, that's essentially monopsony. So then, once you eliminate labor market frictions, I'll show you that in more details in a bit. Firms essentially face more competition, so they have to increase their wages even more than not the effect on productivity. What happens within West and East? Well, you have a big gap in the sense that within East, there is a much bigger increase in both output and wages. Some of that is just selection, because I told you, West workers tend to be better on unobservability, and so they move to the East. But some of that is also that the East face stronger competition from the West and vice versa. And so that leads essentially this competition effect to be stronger. And I'll show you that again in the figure in a bit. How about difference by people born in the West or in the East? Again, you have much bigger gains from people born in the East. Well, why? Because now they have access to all this labor market in the West where firms pay higher wage. Okay. So these are the aggregate effects. And by the way, I just look at East versus West. Of course, we have 4 locations, but the big difference is East versus West. So I just look at those two to keep things easy. So again, take away relatively large gains. I don't know, 4 or 5%, depending if you think those are smaller than some other numbers in the literature. But of course, because we shut down a lot of mechanisms, we don't have occupations or anything like that. But still, there are relatively large gains. Bigger gains on wage because monopoly power goes down, and especially much bigger gains for people, for East Germans and for East Germany. What happens? Forget about the value function anyway. I don't love this result. Let's focus on this number here. What happens is that as you get these gains, people actually move from the West to the East and not vice versa. Why? Well, because effectively at baseline, there are more people that are attached to the West. And so somehow, once you shut down completely the spatial frictions, you have that there is almost a bigger movement from the West to the East and not vice versa. So definitely this movement of just net movement of people is not what drives the aggregate gains. As I mentioned already, the aggregate gains are really driven by what happens within each locations across the firm size distribution. So let me
10%.
Yeah,
10% of net change to understand this aggregate.
That's correct. Yes. So 10%. So sorry.
It's large. No?
It's huge. It's absolutely huge. Essentially, there is a 10% of the overall population moves from the West to the East. Sorry, am I reading this correctly? That's not true. It's 8%. Sorry, it's 8% because a 10% decline in the share of people in the West, which is 80% of baseline. Yeah, it's still very large though. It's still very large.
That's huge.
Yeah, it's large. Honestly, I think it's kind of too large to some extent. And that's definitely something that you you can get rid of it. But the reason why, like, you have this like a very large movement, it is essentially that you have this big asymmetry at baseline, because we keep like the asymmetry on the number of people like born in the West. Have a big asymmetry at baseline essentially of how many people there are in the West, and so then the shock in terms of just the big labor supply shock is actually bigger in the East. But let me say something, because this is like, it's large, but it's not crazy. So like, if you look at what happens, for example, like, in Germany in 1992, the probability that West Germans moved to the East was much smaller, but the flows of West Germans from West to East in the first few years after the very, very initial wave is almost as large. And that is because there are so many West Germans that there are a lot of them that actually have opportunities to go to the East. So some of this we essentially have seen it. Okay. Now, let me shed a little bit more light on the mechanism. And there are two things that I want to highlight. One, it is essentially within versus across region. And the other one, it is the importance of equilibrium adjustment. So to do the within versus between regions, essentially what we do it is that we just mechanically kind of like shut down, just when we do the counterfactual, any between regions movement. So think of it as like, we compute the counterfactual, but then when we compute the aggregate statistics, we keep the share of people in each locations at baseline. What do you have? Well, on the aggregate is even higher, the overall gain, because as I told you, on net, there are people going from the West to the East. But of course, you have big heterogeneity in terms of like the East versus West. So if you look, for example, by birthplace, the gains of people born in the East are much smaller if you keep the within location fixed. Why? Because for East-born people, a big chunk of their gain it is that they relocate from the East to the West. And instead, of course, for symmetry, for West-born people, you have the opposite. Now, how about wages? Again, you have very symmetric stuff. Okay, that the relationship are less skewed, and that is literally just because you don't have the shift of people from the West to the East, and of Westerner from the West to the East. But again, in terms of the aggregate, you have the same, and it's just mechanical. This line is higher than this one just because here we remove this net relocation from West to the East. Now, what is maybe more interesting, it is looking at essentially the change in the distributions of workers as a function of firm productivity. So first focus on this figure here. This is all the workers, and this is at baseline. Again, the model is very consistent with the data that there is a lot of overlap in the sense that there are some firms which are high productive in the East, and some that are high productive and some that are low productive in the West. And so what I'm showing you here is essentially the CDF, they overlap a lot. Now, what happens once I shut down all the spatial frictions? Well, look at the bottom here. Of course, now, the bottoms by construction essentially have to be the same, because the marginal firm that operates is going to be the same in East and West. Because bad East firms are not anymore shielded from West competition. And so what happens is shift the whole distribution essentially towards the high productive firms. And this is really kind of the key again. So let me repeat it. What happens is that at baseline, there is a lot of overlap, but there are more bad firms in the East. Once you shut down any spatial frictions, a lot of these bad firms in the East are going to be competed away. And so still, even after you shut down the spatial friction, there are going to be more bad firms in the East, but the overall distributions of labor is kind of more concentrated, and this effect is stronger in the East simply because they start from a worse distribution.
Can I ask you a little bit? I didn't see the production function doesn't have a fixed cost, no?
No.
So this is only reduction in the size of the firms.
No, because remember, what happens here is that essentially you have heterogeneous, sorry, this is because I didn't show you, but you have heterogeneous productivity. Production function is linear, it's P times L.
Okay.
And then you're going to have a choke price, a choke productivity essentially, because you have to pay a minimum wage, which is making the individual indifferent between joining you or separating into unemployment. And essentially, so there's going to be some firms exiting, and then that is going to be really at the bottom. And then a lot of what's happening is that even the firms that are at the bottom, even the one that stay in, I actually show you that in a second here. just jump around because anyway, like, you know, I need to jump around. So these are like, you know, the posted vacancies. The firms at the very bottom essentially like, you know, exit, post 0 vacancies, but all the firms which essentially have low productivity, they decrease the number of vacancies that they post. And why? Because essentially their profit margins are squeezed, and essentially, so this is what then generates like a reallocation of labor towards the high productivity firms. And because this is really like, you know, somehow like, you know, the bulk of what's happened is equilibrium forces that essentially like, you know, bad firms are shielded from competition from spatial frictions. Once you remove spatial frictions, bad firms, they cannot compete anymore. They see the profit margin squeeze, they post few vacancies or they exit. And these essentially lead to reallocation towards the high productivity firms.
In your model, you are targeting the size of the firms?
Correct, yes.
Okay.
I'm targeting not the full size of the firm, I'm targeting essentially the relationship between the size of the firm and the firm wage. I'm targeting the ladder that I showed you at the beginning. Because, you know, there may be other differences essentially in size heterogeneity that we do not want to target. Think of it as like industry differences and so on and so forth. So essentially I take out a lot of fixed effect and then I project essentially the wage on size and I just target that projection.
Because I was thinking that implicitly in your model, you cannot have that firm move from the west to the east. And that
That's correct, yeah.
So that could be nice. This is another movement in some sense that's whether if the local bias is so high, the home bias for workers so high, you will have incentive to move firms.
Yeah, that's totally true, and that's something that, you know, unfortunately we do not see. So we do see more entry in the east, but we do not see whether the new establishment are firms that were in the west and then open an establishment in the east. You're absolutely correct. Like, you know, labor is cheap in the east in relative terms, and so then you should see essentially firms like, you know, opening up there, but we don't have the data on that, and so like, you know, in the model essentially. That is just about vacancy posting, and then we estimate like, you know, vacancy posting cost in order to match the total mass of firms that are in the east and the west.
But I understand you have employee data set, no? So you cannot see that whether you can see whether there are new firms.
You could try to see. So the problem is that we don't really have everyone in the firm, but but I have access to that data, but with a different set of quarters. Now with that data, actually, that's an interesting point. You could see if everyone moves. You can think of the establishment relocating. It's tricky because I think more it is a new establishment opening up rather than that, you know, you close down and you relocate everyone. I think that's unlikely. Also, that should not happen given our model somehow, but it's something that, you know, at least I can check in the data. Okay, let me like, you know, move forward. So essentially, like, you know, what I'm showing you here, and you know, I can actually show you even just like in terms of bar. The other exercise that we do it is like, you know, the partial equilibrium exercise. So it's essentially not allow firms to like, you know, change their wages nor like, you know, change their vacancy posting. So you see that the aggregate gains are very small. Why? Because the aggregate gains are not really driven just by the mechanical kind of like, you know, climbing up a general ladder, but really the aggregate gains are a lot driven by changes in like, you know, firm optimization essentially, and the fact that the bad firms can like, you know, exit or like, you know, decline the number of vacancies they post. Okay, and again, you also see this nice kind of like asymmetry in the sense that if you shut down like in partial equilibrium, still the born east people benefit. Still the born east people benefit a lot, even in partial equilibrium. Why? Because the born east people, they just benefit from accessing into the west market, but you don't have aggregate gains. Because essentially in partial equilibrium, the benefit of the born east comes at the cost of the born west. In general equilibrium, instead, everyone benefits. And the reason why everyone benefits is again because you have these productivity gains from like, you know, reallocation of labor towards better productive firms. Okay. Any question on this? Otherwise, I have one more result and then I'll conclude. Okay. Let me jump to the last result. So last, like, you know, this is really almost like, you know, it's the last figure of the paper, but I think is the one that like, you know, I prefer in terms of the punchline. So what we do it is now like, you know, we have our estimated model and we can try to say, okay, how important is all this job into matching the micro for the macro? if you only care about the cost of spatial frictions, does it matter matching the micro, or it's enough to just match the east-west wage gap? So what do? It is essentially we take our model, we just vary some parameters of the micro, so the local labor market, in order to generate more or less job flows. Okay, so we either decrease the vacancy cost, or we decrease the search cost of workers in order to generate more job flows or less job flows. And then what we do is we have this different estimated different economies. We just recompute first just the wage gap between East and West, and we see it is identical. So essentially our model is consistent with very different micro functioning of the labor market, but similar wage gap between East and West. And then we take these different economies and try to quantify the impact on the aggregate of shutting down the spatial frictions. And here you see a big difference. So if the micro labor market has a lot more mobility, the gains from removing spatial frictions are much smaller than not if the local labor market has less mobility. What's happening is actually fairly obvious. If there is a lot of local mobility, already labor is concentrated to the good firms locally. Then opening up to the whole German labor market doesn't really matter, because the local labor market has enough competition to essentially concentrate labor towards the good firms. If instead locally the labor market doesn't really work well, there's very little mobility, there is too much labor at the bad firms, that is where you really get these big gains from removing spatial friction. And so this essentially was a takeaway, this last figure here is and the comparison between these last two figures is the takeaway that I tried to give you in the slide number 2, that is, you can have two economies that are essentially identical in terms of wage gap, because if you change this micro, it doesn't change the wage gap between East and West. But the true cost of spatial friction is very different, because one economy actually has so much local labor mobility that doesn't really matter if every local labor market is isolated. While inside the other economy, you really need the integration in order to have enough competition to kick out the bad productivity firms. Okay, so let me just conclude. And so then, if there are a couple of questions, I can still have 2 minutes. So what have we done in this paper? Essentially, we try to jointly study the misallocation of labor both across firms within a location, and is in the tradition more of the labor market literature, and across regions. Once we apply essentially our vision to Germany, we got broadly 4 key takeaways. First one, it is essentially that removing spatial frictions can have big gains from improving the location of labor within region. And again, this is different from the Brian and Morten, because this is not about occupation. This is really about essentially concentration of labor just towards the firms that have higher productivity. And what is happening here, it is that essentially is the endogenous monopsony power of firms that is reducing once you open up the size of the market. And therefore, as a result of this mechanism, essentially the aggregate gains can vary substantially as a function of the local labor market frictions. But as I emphasized before, this is only true for the aggregate, not for the distributional ones, because the distributional gains, or meaning that the gains from giving access to people born in the East to the bigger labor market, those are fairly mechanical and are not affected by any equilibrium component, and therefore are not as driven by what's happening within regions, but is more about between regional stuff. So overall, hopefully, this is a framework that can be used to study more labor allocation across firms of space, a unified framework. And that's it. Thank you so much for all the comments and questions.
Thanks, Tommaso. We have a couple of minutes for more questions, so feel free to jump in.
May I ask you, we didn't see the firms. Do you have here some kind of sorting in terms of the production function? I haven't seen the production function, so
we haven't. So yeah, I haven't show you anything. I guess I could have maybe show you at least this. So here, this is the wage essentially. Sorry. Okay, so this is also important. So since I'm here, let me show you also this. So a given individual gets paid a wage per efficiency unit, but then what really that individual gets in terms of flow utility is that multiplied by the number of efficiency units, which is theta, And so this is the nominal wage you observe, and then the tau tells you essentially how much you like dollars, and then on the production function is literally just P times the total size of a firm, and the total size of a firm is just the size of efficiency unit of labor. And so you have to sum up over all the different types that you hire, and they have a given productivity. So there is no complementarity, apart from the fact that, of course, if you are in West Germany, you will like to have most workers that have a competitive advantage towards West Germany. But in practice, once we estimate this competitive advantage, we find pretty much nothing, so that doesn't really matter much.
Tommaso, I know that you're doing, given the data you have, you're sort of doing everything sort of indirectly through the model, but is there something you could show in terms of what exactly these frictions are? I mean, Germany, there's been a lot of labor reforms in Germany. Germany is a country that has overall, it's not like South America, in which everything is in the capital. Germany has sort of spread out relatively. If you take out Berlin, I think size distribution across cities is not that heterogeneous.
That's true.
So what do you think of what are these frictions in practice? I guess the train system the transportation system is sort of fairly integrated.
Yeah. So again, I don't think
kind of more directly.
I don't think there are particularly big frictions, honestly. So if you go to the you look at this map here, and it seems oh gosh, there has to be huge frictions. But then actually what we estimate it is that the cost of moving from here to here is just $20,000. That doesn't strike to me like it's a big cost. Literally, that is literally the mobility cost, which seems reasonable. You have to pack your stuff and move. The tau, so that's a preference parameter. Remember, essentially we estimate that East Germans have a 10% dislike of living in the West, but also Northeast Germans have a 7% dislike of living to Southeast. So maybe the 2-3% is really about discrimination. We collect a bunch of articles East Germans are a little bit discriminated in the West, but that's a small stuff. Fundamentally, is that people really like to live where they're born. So we have actually an appendix of the paper where we show that you're very likely to go back home after you have a kid and after you get married. And so that will show up as a tau in our model. Essentially, that is, you have a kid in the West, but you want to have your family close nearby, you go back home. That would be a tau. And again, these numbers are very reasonable, 7 to 10%. It's easy to justify them. The one that is very big is the search one. But essentially what that tells us, it tells us that people get jobs through connections, get jobs through random interactions, which I think there is plenty of evidence for it. In general. So I'm not surprised. I don't think that those numbers are particularly large. It will be interesting to compare them across countries. Unfortunately, we need to do the type of exercise we've done here with matched employee data. We haven't really done it in different countries, but I will not think that these are very large frictions. It's kind of remarkable how these frictions can support this equilibrium. And again, the reason it is that there is so much mobility that I don't know, still you can have a big wage gap, but actually there's a lot of overlap. It's not that everyone could just move by paying that kappa cost.
Do you have this data in terms of age? In some sense, it's very impressive. The difference between East and West is still. So you can think that should be changing over time in terms of the youth that's born after, I don't know, some years should be. Whether you still have the same thing, more or less.
We decided not to have it considered. So if you look at average wage gap between East and West, it's larger for old people, but the difference between old and young people is I think 6 percentage points on a baseline of 27. So it's not huge. And most of that, by the way, is driven by the individual fixed effect. So the AKM that you estimate for old East Germans is 7 percentage point lower in different right to the youngest Germans. So youngest Germans are 5 percentage point lower than West Germans, and old East Germans are 12 percentage point. Yeah, but essentially, even if you look at the young, you still have a big gap of roughly 22%.
My final
Tommaso?
question. Sorry.
I just had maybe an extended question from your work about like remote work and how could this work, how your estimates could be used to kind of understand the impact on these frictions that remote work can have. Like I know you only use data up until 2014, and I don't know the specific case of Germany, but remote work is certainly something that we didn't have before, that now, even though it could be small in some countries, is definitely significant. So
I think that's a great point, and you know, if you look at the paper, essentially we have done the counterfactual where we just shut down the preferences, tau and the kappa, and not the search efficiency. And you can think of that one essentially the one that is relevant for remote work, because I think that the Z, so the ability to generate opportunities, I don't think is as affected by remote work. And so somehow that is a little bit disappointing, because the Z, so is the ability to generate opportunities, is the one that has actually the strongest bite in our counterfactual relative to these, think of it as the willingness to take these opportunities, which is the kappa and the tau. And so sure, of course there are gains, but the big problem here seems to be that people just don't have opportunities to get these good jobs in the West. And so somehow you need to, I don't know, have online job platform, move away from referrals that we know are heavily used still in high income countries. And that seems to be really the key margin to get productivity gains.
In the same idea, it will be very nice whether you can see that you can imagine that these search costs fall after some people already gone to some area in the West, for example. So whether then you start to have some movement from one region in the East to one region in the West, trying to, in some sense, to give an estimation how to estimate this.
Yeah, and that we have it, right? So that's true, also in our model. So essentially this different stuff here, pretty much what it shows, this 24%. So essentially once you go from East to the West, once you are in the West, then you're better at generating new offers in the West. So that's also happening in here, and it's a big difference. It's a factor of 3 or 4. So what is really
my point is that there is some kind of externality, whether
that I don't know. And by the way, and I think also that's true, in the sense that if you have more. So actually something that we used to do in this agenda at some point in the past, it is we look at where people are going, and they are East Germans today are more likely to go to those counties where essentially people migrated 40 years ago randomly. And so that definitely matters, and that is not in the paper. What we have in the paper is that once you go from the East to the West, that you individually you have better ability to search locally, and that seems to matter, because you go there and then you have more job opportunities there. You don't just fall down the job ladder, which is something that could have happened, right? We could have estimated that to be very important, but no. Once you're there, you generate those offers. Not as well as how you say? Actually, is this object here? It's not as well as someone that is not born there, but almost as. So this is the 90%. You only have a 10% penalty once you are in that location.